The question everybody is asking right now is Matthew Stafford a Hall of Famer? That's a good question. In this video, I'm going to give you my answer, my thoughts, and my analysis on whether Matthew Stafford is a Hall of Famer right now or not. So let's break down if Matthew Stafford deserves to be called a Hall of Famer. But before I do, make sure that you do spike that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more BLV NFL discussions just like this. And if you enjoy this format of video, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to do more discussions just like this. So Matthew Stafford, he won his Super Bowl, and not only did he win his Super Bowl, now he's got a ring. But he did it in the first season outside of Detroit. He proved all of the doubters, the haters, wrong. And yet, there are still haters. PFF. But is one Super Bowl ring enough to be a Hall of Famer? Of course, Matthew Stafford has had a very good career. For most of his career, he's been regarded as a good quarterback. But really, is he a Hall of Famer? And if I were to answer this question right now, before even diving into my thoughts and diving into the breakdown, my answer would be that if Matthew Stafford retired tomorrow, he would not be a Hall of Famer. Matthew Stafford would not be a Hall of Famer if he retired tomorrow. But luckily, at least I don't think Matthew Stafford is going to retire tomorrow. That means he has a few more years to add to his legacy, add to his resume, and then ultimately become a Hall of Famer. So at the end of this video, I want to determine if Matthew Stafford has what it takes to become that Hall of Famer, compare him to Hall of Famers, compare him to players that might get into the Hall of Fame, and take a look at his career to see if he has enough of a resume right now to build upon to become a Hall of Famer. So ultimately, the answer is Matthew Stafford is not a Hall of Famer yet, but can he be? The unique thing about Matthew Stafford's career, it has massive context. And I believe that this one season, the first season that he went to LA, he wins a Super Bowl, right? It adds massive context to the rest of his career. His entire Detroit Lions career has become recontextualized, which is massive for his Hall of Fame odds, because now voters and fans alike are going to look at Matthew Stafford in a totally different light than they might have previously, other than me, of course. But you have people that are going to be out there and say beforehand that Matthew Stafford was just never that guy, that he was just always a loser, he was forever a loser, he was never going to be able to be a great quarterback. But now that he won with a different team, and not only won, but in that first season, as I continued to say and state, it's very important, that has completely changed Matthew Stafford in the eyes of many. Now, people will discuss Matthew Stafford's career as, well, it wasn't really Stafford's fault. Well, maybe if he had a running game, or maybe if he had a more consistent defense, or maybe if he had this or that, or maybe if he had a coach like McVay for longer, or if he had this situation or that situation, or this went right or that went right. So obviously Matthew Stafford isn't in that category where he could win no matter the situation. Kind of like a Tom Brady or a Peyton Manning, let's say. But he is in that next group of players that kind of situational dependent, but very, very good and very, very talented. That is what the Rams have done for Matthew Stafford. And what Matthew Stafford did for the Rams, which is a part of his legacy, instantly when he was added to the team, they became the best team in the NFL. They went from a good team to a great Super Bowl champion team. So that means for Matthew Stafford, there's a lot of hypothetical. You know the old hypothetical talk when it comes to quarterbacks? We always hear it with Aaron Rodgers, right? Well, if Aaron Rodgers had Bill Belichick and his defenses and Tom Brady's supporting staff, he would have won 10 Super Bowls. Oh, maybe 15. We always hear that sort of stuff, right? With Matthew Stafford now, it's that same sort of logic where you could be like, well, what if Stafford was even in Green Bay? Maybe he has 2 rings. Stafford, if he was in Seattle, Seattle, he might have 3 rings. So there's so much discussion that can be had with Matthew Stafford when it comes to, well, if he just wasn't in Detroit for this many years, he could have been this player or that player. And believe it or not, that actually does add to his legacy and probably benefits him when talking about the Hall of Fame case, because a lot of people will look at him and say, well, he was extremely talented and his resume, it's not the greatest, but he was so good and he was stuck in this bad spot and he proved that he was so good when he went to the Rams. And that's what the voters are going to think when Matthew Stafford and his name pops up for the discussion of whether or not he belongs in the Hall of Fame. Because let's face it, in Detroit, one Hall of Fame wide receiver does not make a great team. At the end of the 2010s, I actually made a list ranking the top 10 quarterbacks from that decade. And Matthew Stafford ranked as the 10th best quarterback of the 2010s, of that decade. So a lot of discussion about Stafford is being had when it comes to whether he has been elite enough in enough seasons for him to be considered a Hall of Famer. Now, the 10th best quarterback of a decade might not quite be worthy of getting into the Hall of Fame. He has begun this decade pretty well with a Super Bowl victory to his name, and of course, we're going to have more seasons of him with LA to add to his legacy. But just taking what he has accomplished so far in his career, you can see that he's already put up a pretty good resume, even just from Detroit. During that decade, he was 5th in yards, so he was top 5 in yardage. He was 6th in overall touchdown passes throughout the 2010s. He also missed quite a few games during that span, and he had the most comebacks of any single quarterback throughout that decade. He also had the most comebacks in a single season during that decade, and I believe the most comebacks in a season of all time, which I believe is the 2016 NFL season. He is also one of only 9 players to throw for 5,000 yards in a NFL season, and he's one of only 6 players to have thrown for 5,000 yards and 40 touchdowns in 1 year, which happened in 2011. Some of his accolades include the Comeback Player of the Year award in that 2011 season. He led the NFL in completions once. He led the NFL in game-winning drives 3 times. He led the NFL in comebacks 2 times, and he is a 1-time Pro Bowler, which is really the number that a lot of people are pausing on and saying, well, you're a 1-time Pro Bowler. You've never been an All-Pro. How could you possibly ever make the Hall of Fame? And that's something that I want to discuss in terms of looking at Stafford's play versus his peers throughout his time in the NFL, and looking at how many seasons I would regard him as a top 10 or a top 5 quarterback. So going throughout his career, I believe that he was a top 5 quarterback in the 2011 season for sure, without a doubt, without a question in mind. He was a top 5 quarterback for that season, having thrown 5,000 yards, having made the playoffs, having thrown 40 plus touchdowns. That is a top 5 season statistically, and when you watch it back, his arm strength, all of that pops really early in his career, and he's clearly a very talented player at that time, especially at that time in terms of his pocket movement and ability to escape the rush. The team fell on Stafford's shoulders along with Megatron, and that was the reason they won games. Other seasons you could consider Matthew Stafford to be a top 5 quarterback would be the 2016-2017 stretch, where he kind of carried this football team. Both of those seasons, one of them was a playoff appearance that year where he was just continuously coming back in games and the reason these teams were winning any sort of games. So for that, I would look closely at those seasons to say Stafford was arguably an MVP candidate at points in these years, and I feel like he was in that conversation for the top 5. He might just be slightly outside, but those are the seasons I look at him in that discussion. Other years where he's certainly in the top 10 are this past season in 2021, definitely 2019, and I believe if he plays all of 2019, he might have won the MVP, but probably not, just because of Lamar Jackson. But Matthew Stafford was putting up ridiculous numbers and probably would have been a top 5 quarterback, and I personally ranked him as the 6th best quarterback entering 2020. And then you also have his Pro Bowl season of 2014, where that was his best overall roster in Detroit. 2015, he had some pretty impressive numbers, 30 plus touchdowns that year. And even in seasons where you wouldn't regard him as a top 10 player that season, 2012, 2013 on some pretty bad teams. He threw for a ton of yards, and he was kind of the reason that they were somewhat competitive in those seasons. And you look at those seasons and say, well, he's second in passing yards in 2012, he's third in passing yards in 2013. And although yards aren't everything, that's a good measure of saying that, okay, you know, maybe if he was on a better team, he would have been regarded slightly higher than he was. In fact, in every season from 2011 through 2014, he threw 600 times. So that just speaks to how important he was as an individual to carry the Detroit Lions through that stretch. Stafford actually has 5 seasons where he ranked top 3 in total yards, and then 3 seasons in the top 5 for passing touchdowns. So certainly statistically, even when you just compare it to the era, because everybody's going to talk about, well, the total yards all time, the total touchdowns all time, that is cool and stuff, but I do personally say there's an asterisk because of the era that he's played in, and that certainly matters to me. But when you look at it against his peers, he's still impressive in terms of his statistics that he's put up. One of the bigger counter arguments is going to be that Stafford just didn't win very often with Detroit. But when you look at his overall success as a winner in the NFL, he has 4 playoff appearances, which when you look at Detroit, he took them to the playoffs. And why I'm saying that is because they hadn't been to the playoffs before that since, like, I think Barry Sanders' MVP season of like 94 or 95, somewhere in that stretch. And other than that, they didn't make the playoffs until 2011 with Matthew Stafford. So Stafford was really the only quarterback or the only leader of the team or the only time the Lions ever had any sort of success to make the playoffs. 2011, 2014, 2017, made the playoffs in those years. On top of 2021 with the Rams, he also made the playoffs. Now, he also had losing seasons with the Lions, which is expected. He had 5 losing seasons where he played the whole year. He also had other seasons where he went 3-4-1 in that 2019 shortened season, and also a losing season as a rookie when he also only played 10 games. So there's certainly injured seasons that hurt him as well. But then you have 5 winning seasons overall, and some of them where they didn't make the playoffs in Detroit, which is also speaking to the success that he had in Detroit. When you look at the track record of the Detroit Lions over their legacy and over their history, they just aren't a good franchise, period. Something that actually kind of does help him when you compare him to some of his peers that are in the same conversation. His playoff record is above 500 now after this playoff run. He has 4 playoff wins now. He only had those 3 appearances before, and he was 0-3 before the Rams, which might hurt him slightly, I guess, but saying that he's now above 500, when you compare him to his peers, that might not be a bad thing, especially if he can add more wins in the future. So to answer the question, was he ever the best in the NFL? Clearly, he was never the best quarterback in the NFL. Could he be the best? Maybe. I mean, within the next 2 years, if Matthew Stafford won an MVP, would it be absolutely shocking? I don't think so. Could you, at the end of the day, including the playoffs, say that he was maybe a top 3 or 4 quarterback this year? You probably could, to be honest with you. And on top of that, okay, we've got Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, and all of these, for sure, Hall of Famers and top 10 quarterbacks of all time probably are going to rank in the top 3 most seasons that they play. And clearly Stafford is not in that discussion, but he's in the next tier of guys that occasionally popped into the top 5 or made a case to be in that MVP conversation. And this is why I don't love the all-pro conversation. And what I mean by the all-pro debate is that an all-pro is going to designate you as a great player and designate you for the Hall of Fame. And this is something Richard Sherman brought up. I strongly disagree when it comes to quarterbacks. And the reason I say that is because the quarterback position, you have one first-team all-pro. One quarterback every season gets named the all-pro for that season. And it's going to be the MVP of the NFL, period. That's it. Not like the corner position where you could have up to 3 corners or 2 safeties or 2 linebackers or 3 linebackers, multiple defensive ends. Every other position basically has more than one All-Pro designation. So the quarterback designation really comes down to whether or not you won the MVP, because the MVP is a quarterback award, period. So when you look at the history of the Hall of Fame and guys that are in the Hall of Fame that didn't make an All-Pro team, well, there are a few of them, and actually some big names that you wouldn't even think or consider. That includes Troy Aikman. That includes Warren Moon. That includes Jim Kelly. That includes John Elway, of all quarterbacks, who didn't even become a first-team All-Pro in any given season. There is one quarterback in the Hall of Fame that I believe is a great comparison for Matthew Stafford, and that guy is Warren Moon. Warren Moon did have great longevity. Of course, he played in the CFL, so there's that little bit of a layer to his career. But when you look at his playoff success, not much. 3-7 in the playoffs. So that's less playoff wins than Matthew Stafford currently has. He was never an MVP. He was never an All-Pro. He did have Pro Bowls, and he did have a lot of stats. And that is really where you compare Matthew Stafford and Warren Moon. But on top of that, Matthew Stafford has that Super Bowl to his name. So Warren Moon is a guy already into the Hall of Fame that probably, if you're saying that Stafford shouldn't be in either. And then you look at a guy like Jim Kelly, who sure went to 4 Super Bowls. He lost all of them, right? He never won a Super Bowl, and he never won an MVP, and he never was an All-Pro, and his stats really aren't as impressive as Matthew Stafford's, to be honest with you, even accounting for the era. I believe that there are quarterbacks in the Hall of Fame that when you pick and choose their careers, Troy Aikman never put up the stats, but he had the Super Bowls. Kurt Warner had like 5 good seasons, but a couple of them, he was an All-Pro. A couple of them, he was up for MVP or he won the Super Bowl. So there's some careers where you just say like, well, if that guy's in, then this guy should be in. And that's where it becomes, already put these people in the Hall of Fame. The best way to judge if you're a Hall of Famer or not is by the guys already in the Hall of Fame. Now, on top of the guys that are already in the Hall of Fame, you have to talk about the players and the quarterbacks that probably will be in the Hall of Fame. One of them is Ben Roethlisberger. And Ben Roethlisberger, when you compare his career to Matthew Stafford, Stafford was in a way worse situation, and there's no debate about that. But Big Ben, great quarterback. I think he's a Hall of Famer. He has 2 Super Bowl wins. Never an MVP. Never an All-Pro. A ton of Pro Bowls to his name, but really not super impressive in terms of the career individually, which is what Richard Sherman and people that will say Stafford is not a Hall of Famer will suggest. And if you think Ben is a Hall of Famer, which I think 70% of people do, then why isn't Stafford even close to this conversation? On top of that, Eli Manning, who has 2 Super Bowl wins, 2 Super Bowl MVPs, but very little individual accolades, and he's probably going to be in the Hall of Fame, mostly because his last name's Manning, but still. And then you compare him to guys that I believe are kind of on the borderline. You look at Matt Ryan. You look at Phillip Rivers. These quarterbacks could get into the Hall of Fame. And I believe they have a decent chance of getting into the Hall of Fame. Personally, they're very similar to Matthew Stafford's career, but they do not have a Super Bowl win. Now, Matt Ryan is probably the best comp because Matt Ryan was really close to winning a Super Bowl, but he does have an MVP. He does have that All-Pro from the MVP season, and he does have more Pro Bowls to his name. Their stats are very close and comparable. I think Stafford, that one individual season of 2011, is probably more impressive than any season Matt Ryan ever had, statistically speaking. But when you look at Matt Ryan's career and Stafford's career, they're very, very similar, and their situations are kind of similar. Matt Ryan's has probably been a bit better, but it's not like they're drastically different. So that is really interesting. What do you weigh more? The Super Bowl win, the clutch in the playoffs, or Matt Ryan not coming up with that victory and coming up short and choking? Ultimately, the team choked in that game. So there are some things to consider with both of those players, and I personally believe that Stafford's career will probably surpass Ryan's by the time both of them retire, but they'll both be very close in the same sort of group and same sort of conversation. The other thing to consider about Matt Ryan is that they have the same amount of playoff wins. They both have 4 playoff wins, but Matt Ryan has 6 playoff losses. Stafford, again, above 500 in the playoffs and could add to that in the future. And the final guy to discuss here, who is a peer of Stafford, is Phillip Rivers. Phillip Rivers is strange because I consider him to be a better player than his career suggests. He has 8 Pro Bowls, which is pretty impressive, but 0 MVPs, 0 All-Pros. His playoff career is pretty lousy, and he consistently kind of underwhelmed in that environment, going 5-7 in the playoffs, so he does have one more playoff win than Stafford at the moment. But he did lead the NFL in yards once, touchdowns once, rating once, and 2008 was very close to an MVP campaign for him, and personally I look at that statistically, and it's maybe more impressive than Manning. He just didn't have the victories and the wins that Manning had that year. So Rivers is a tough one. Stafford has the Super Bowl that Rivers never achieved, and they both don't have an MVP, and they both don't have all pros, but Rivers does have more Pro Bowls, so are you weighing that over what Stafford has achieved? I personally would not, and personally, I look at winning above all else. I look at statistics. Individual accolades are a big deal for Hall of Fame standards, and it's a really tough conversation to have because quarterbacks matter most to wins and losses, and ultimately, Stafford has proven that probably the environment he was in Detroit wasn't quite good enough. And that is where it's tough with Stafford because he wasn't so great that it was undeniable, but he was very, very good. And once he went to a better situation, he was to that standard of if he was with the Rams long term, he might have accumulated some more Super Bowls, some more MVPs, some All-Pros. And that's where maybe you would argue he's a Hall of Famer. But that's the craziness of this conversation. And that's why I think time will decide this case. If Matthew Stafford continues to put up some good numbers, maybe even lead a couple categories like touchdowns or yards, maybe pop in an MVP or an All-Pro, then he's probably going to be a Hall of Famer. If he only adds this Super Bowl to his already decent resume and he doesn't do much else, then I don't think he's going to make it. But for now, congratulations, Stafford, for the Super Bowl. I've always been a fan of the way you play, and I think right now you're a Hall of Very Good. And let's see if you can become a Hall of Fame. Let me know in the comment section below where you stand on Matthew Stafford and if you would put him in the Hall of Fame now or potentially in the future. It's Mitch. Thanks for watching. Gronk, spike that like button, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace.